You're listening to a podcast by the Perennial Leader Project. What can we know for sure? A curious paradox of wisdom is the need to let go of the traditional idea of knowing or learning. In this episode of In Search of Wisdom, we're exploring the art of not knowing. This is another meditation from our Wisdom is the Way course, which you can access by becoming a Perennial Meditations member on Substack. Specifically, today we're going to discuss how and why we must practice not knowing, how to work with our assumptions, and so much more. All right, without any further delay, I hope you enjoy this episode. Many of you have probably heard a famous quote attributed to Socrates that says, "All that I know is that I know nothing." Plato, a student of Socrates, put it this way, quote, "We do not know, neither the sophists, nor the orators, nor the artists, nor I, what the true, the good, and the beautiful are. But there is this difference between us. Although these people know nothing, they all believe they know something. Whereas I, if I know nothing, at least I have no doubts about it. As a result, all this superiority in wisdom which the oracle has attributed to me reduces itself to the single point that I am strongly convinced that I am ignorant of what I do not know." End quote. Over a millennia later, the philosopher Michel de Montaigne also stressed the notion of not knowing. He famously lived by the maxim, "All that I know is that I know nothing, and I'm not even sure of that." In his essays, Montaigne explained, quote, "If others examine themselves attentively, as I do, they would find themselves as I do, full of inanity and nonsense. Get rid of it? I cannot without getting rid of myself. We are all steeped in it, one as much as another. But those aware of it are a little better off, though I don't know." End quote. Whether we call it skepticism, not knowing, intellectual humility, or the beginner's mind, recognizing that these terms are not about simply knowing nothing is essential. Not knowing is a philosophy of life about being curious and open-minded to discover the truth. As the French theologian Peter Abelard observed, the beginning of wisdom is found in doubting. By doubting, we come to the question, and by seeking, we may come upon the truth. Obviously, many others throughout history have said similar things. I've already mentioned Socrates and Montaigne, but there's a long list of great thinkers touting this practice of not knowing. In a previous meditation titled A History of Ignorance, we explored the thoughts of various philosophers and thinkers. In ancient China, the collected sayings of Confucius include the following passage. "Shall I tell you what knowledge is? It is to know both what one knows and what one does not know." In a similar way, the classic of philosophical Taoism, the Book of the Way, attributed to Lao Tzu, includes the statement that to know what is not knowledge is the better part. In his book, Ignorance, A Global History, the British historian Peter Burke explains, In ancient Greece, Socrates moved in a similar direction. According to his disciple Plato, Socrates claimed to be wiser than a man who thinks he knows something when he does not. Socrates began what has been described as an epistemological turn in Greek philosophy. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with how we acquire knowledge and know it is reliable. Its opposite number, ignorance's epistemology, concerns how and why we remain ignorant. One might say this is the beginning of learning. Paradoxically, one of the benefits of learning new things and exploring a range of topics is that it helps one to become less confident, or, put another way, aware of their own ignorance. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a well-known cognitive bias, whereby people with limited knowledge or competence in a given domain vastly overestimate their knowledge. Some of you might remember my conversation with Dr. Woo King Ahn, author of Thinking 101, when she revealed that most biases stem from overconfidence. And the fluency effect is one of the most insidious and irrational of the cognitive biases. Dr. Ahn explained, quote, "The perceived fluency of an impending task makes us underestimate the difficulty of executing it. Descriptions of the underlying mechanisms behind certain claims make unacceptable assertions of fact seem more acceptable, even though those, quote, facts haven't changed. But our judgments can also be distorted by the perceived fluency of factors that are completely irrelevant to the judgments they cause us to make," end quote. The fluency effect stems from a simple, straightforward rule in what cognitive psychologists call metacognition, which means knowing whether you know something. Metacognition guides our actions. Knowing what we know tells us what to avoid, what to search for, or what to dive or not dive into. We can't live without it, stressed Dr. Ahn. However, adopting the approach of not knowing is often much easier said than done. We naturally desire certainty. The longtime Buddhist meditation teacher, Wes Niger, author of The Essential Crazy Wisdom, suggests that many of us see doubt as a negative state, a continual restlessness, or frowning skepticism. But this doesn't need to be so. It is possible to embrace and even enjoy the uncertainty and mysteries of life. We need to remember that on the other side of doubt lies wonder. In his book, The Socratic Method, author Ward Farnsworth explains that the practitioner of the Socratic method thinks in questions, is at home with uncertainty, and knows the value of a search that simply doesn't end. The wisdom of not knowing enables us to break our love of holding on to opinions. It feels good to know what you think, and often when people turn to philosophy, writes Farnsworth, they usually want more of that pleasure. But according to Socrates, our most urgent problem is we are certain when we shouldn't be, and we think we know when we do not. For this reason, Socrates' philosophy is not a set of beliefs, it's an activity. The Socratic method, or you might say, in this case, the wisdom of not knowing, does not replace our opinions with better ones. It changes our relationship to our opinions. It replaces the love of holding them with the love of testing them. The wisdom of not knowing is a required perspective to learn how to live, or to learn anything at all. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught his students that if a man would pursue philosophy, his first task is to throw away conceit, For it is impossible for a man to begin to learn what he believes that he already knows. As we discussed in one of the exercises on the art of noticing, we must get intentional about cultivating our perspectives and leading our lives. Only when we deliberately focus on noticing how these perspectives shape our lives can we work to unravel faulty assumptions. To conclude this episode, I want us to take a few minutes and really think deeply about putting some of these ideas into practice in daily life. What does it look like? Why should we? How do we actually remember to practice the art of not knowing, which is counterintuitive? It's not our default setting, if you will. There's a passage in Epictetus's Discourses that says, "Don't let the force of an impression when it first hits you knock you off your feet. Just say to it, 'Hold on a moment. Let me see who you are and what you represent. Let me put you to the test.'" I think this is a good way to think about not knowing. The Stoics and many others would talk about things like an impression. An impression is an appearance, the way in which something is perceived. It's how our minds work. When we see something or experience something as we're navigating daily life, obviously we're going to get some sort of input from that. We're going to get an impression. We're going to get a judgment, however you would want to call it. Our minds are attempting to make sense of whatever it may be. How should we navigate this situation? And as Epictetus puts it, well, hold on a moment. Let me put you to the test. How do we learn to maybe just hold these impressions loosely, hold these judgments loosely, put them to the test, examine them? Oftentimes, we're making assumption upon assumption. It's interesting when Socrates is going around and talking to all of the wisest people in Athens, and he's surprised. He's asking them all sorts of questions that he doesn't quite have the answer to himself, and everyone's responding, giving these long stories about whatever the question may be. What is love? What is virtue? Etc. And it's important to just recognize that many things we don't actually know, or there's many things that are very, very provisional. It depends on so many circumstances. Some of you might remember my conversation with Shyla Catherine, author of the book Beyond Distraction. She's a longtime meditation teacher and someone that is, I think, a real expert in the way of how the mind works. She spent, I think, north of 10 years of her life on silent retreat. And she said this when talking about the content of our thoughts and the process of thinking. Quote, "Many thoughts we get entangled in because we don't recognize that they are a thought. We're so enamored with the story, it's like being caught up in a movie or some kind of drama, and we take it to be reality. So the first major step forward in this process is to be mindful of a thought as a thought. And the thought is not a static thing. It's a process, a dynamic process of thinking. It's a mental activity. So instead of getting lost in the content or the story, we now become mindful of the activity that is occurring. Thinking is happening." End quote. You could call this working with the mind. You could call it humility, skepticism, not knowing, whatever it is that you call it. It's important that we remember we're not always seeing clearly. Oftentimes we don't have the complete story, the complete picture, and our minds fill in all the gaps. They fill in a lot of knowing where there should be not knowing. The more skilled we are at seeing things and examining our initial impressions, the more our perception will work for us rather than against us. It takes humility, wisdom, and courage to say, well, hold on a moment and ask yourself, how might I be wrong? What am I missing? Although the art of not knowing becomes easier over time, testing our impressions is a lifelong practice, and it is by no means a burden. It is a gift. It opens the door to wonder, mystery, and meaning in daily life. Thank you for listening to another episode of the In Search of Wisdom podcast. I hope you found something useful for daily life. If so, I encourage you to put what you heard into practice. If you're interested in more tools for the art of living, consider subscribing to Perennial Meditations on Substack. By becoming a member, you'll help support the project and gain access to our podcasts, meditations, and courses. Until next time, be wise and be well.